Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I just arrived last night from Chicago, so I'm highly caffeinated and deeply jet lagged. And also, I'm American, so I talk extremely fast. So apologize for all of those in advance. It's such an incredible pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to talk about character building and book bans, as I'm going to be specifically talking this morning about the freedom to read and this terrifying tide of book challenges that has been sweeping through America for the last 3 years, and that we seem to be exporting to other countries. I wish we could give you something better than fascism, but that's where we are. But I wanted to begin by doing something that I think Americans are actually fantastic at, which is talking about ourselves. So if you can indulge me, I am going to talk to you why I'm absolutely besotted by your country. And being invited to here, I thought, okay, this is a perfect moment for me to interrogate why I, an Indian-born American Muslim, absolutely love Ireland. And it's not about the weather. I'm from Chicago, so I understand difficult weather, but it's really about the people. You know, I'm an 80s kid, I'm a Gen Xer, and so yes, I had ripped jeans and hairsprayed bangs and a lot of posters of Bono in my bedroom, and so Bono was like the gateway drug to Ireland for me, and I started reading more sort of Irish poetry to learn a little bit about your history. And as I was reading more of it, I started thinking about the parallels between India and Ireland. And, you know, it's not just the love of poetry, which Indians also love poetry. When I was a kid, I was going to so many Urdu poetry readings with my parents, and the Irish also love poetry. And I was like, okay, wait, this is cool. We have this similarity. But then in thinking about it, I realized how both nations had these parallel histories of colonization, how there's this history of language erasure and partition, and how religion is being used as a wedge by colonizers. And I also thought about how both nations fought so hard to preserve who we are, to ensure that our national identity and what we believe in would not be completely erased by the people who loved our country so much they couldn't bear to leave and wanted to take it all for themselves. I even wrote this short story about a fictionalized meeting between one of the Connaught Rangers. Am I pronouncing that right? Connaught, sorry. Connaught Rangers, who was court-martialed in India by the British and executed there. So I created this sort of fictionalized meeting between him and this young Indian woman on a train, bonding over poetry and the power of speaking their own languages, and also what it meant to speak in the language of a colonizer. And I reread that story before I came here, and you know, got me thinking about the conference theme of character building. And, you know, obviously at a lit conference, character building speaks to the creation of our fictional characters. And every time I write a novel, I think about how character building is really just a series of choices that our characters are making. I think about how my protagonist views the world, how that worldview informs their decisions, and how, I mean, it really guides everything they do. Every time they come to a crossroads, big or small, and every time they have to make a decision, that worldview comes into play. And with so many young adult novels, including mine, teens are forced into these situations where they have to make incredibly tough choices. And so often it's because they are confronted by the absolutely terrible decisions that adults make and have imposed upon these young people. I mean, these are teens, kids who can't yet vote, whose voices are routinely silenced or ignored. And those main characters, I mean, these kids are forced to find their courage. They're forced to stand up and speak out. And I so often think about how it's terrible that kids have to do that. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could live in a world where our young people aren't forced into that position, where they could just be kids. Because I think at the end of the day, as adults, it is one of our deepest ethical and moral responsibilities to take care of our children and to love them and to build a world in which they are known and loved and seen and protected. And we fail at that so often. And so, you'll see, I'm talking too fast, right? Okay, I'm sorry if I made your hands tired. So I'm talking about YA novels here, but you can understand how I'm really actually talking about the world we live in, right? Stories of teens fighting for their rights and for their lives. It's not just fiction. And I often say that I like to write the world as it is so we can imagine the world as it could be. I also just realized my timer is not working, so I have no idea how long I've spoken for. I'm sorry. Thank you. I would just talk for like 6 hours if you let me. Okay, great. Just if you bring me some coffee, I'll go like all day long. So living in this world today, I mean, I don't really need to tell you what we're seeing. We're literally seeing a genocide televised. We can watch it on our phones. We have seen the extremes of poverty, starvation, lack of access to clean water, clean air, healthcare, housing, education, the denial of basic human rights as we face a rise of the global elite, of oligarchy with unprecedented wealth and power. So this is really a depressing way to start the morning. But we're not going to leave it that way because I believe so much in hope, and I know all of you do too, because you wouldn't be here at a conference for children's literature if you didn't, because I think that is really foundational in children's literature, hope. Honestly, I wouldn't be a writer if I didn't believe in hope, because I don't believe in hope in this like Pollyanna-ish kind of way, with not big naive eyes, but rather in a way that understands that hope is a verb, hope is an act, and hope is a choice. So we're not going to solve all the global problems today, though, I think maybe if we stepped aside, maybe we could solve a bunch. Because I always think book people are the best people. Yes, right? And I think what I want to talk about more specifically is how we can work to preserve this fundamental right, which is the freedom to read, which is under attack in the US and increasingly across the world. And I'd like to also share one of the poems that I wrote in my novel Internment. Ali Amin, who's the father of the protagonist in this novel, it's a novel about the United States. It came out in 2019. It's a novel how in the United States an authoritarian was elected to power. I wrote this all before the Trump administration. It's about how an authoritarian comes to power and begins putting Muslims in internment camps, paralleling what happened in World War II. Ali Amin, who is the father of the protagonist, is the poet. And just as a side note, I always wanted to be a poet, but I really didn't have much luck getting published. And then I found the best way to become a poet is to become a novelist and then write one of your characters as a poet. Then they're forced to publish your poetry. So this is a poem from that novel. It's called Revolution. Speak to me with your tongue while it is still free, while your body is still yours. Let your words travel through the air, uncontrolled, spontaneous, necessary, tumbling through clouds of dust that dim the sun, until they reach my ear, and so many ears spilled onto the table, waiting. Speak the truth while it is still alive, while lips cracked and bleeding can still move. Time is beholden to neither lover nor tyrant. Say what you must. I will listen. So often when we think about the idea of revolution, we have these images of uprising, but that's not what this poem is about. This poem isn't about taking up literal arms, but maybe doing it more so metaphorically, because revolution is an act of change, of shifting the paradigm, of dismantling privilege. And it's about not giving an inch to haters. It's planting a fat flag. It's taking a side. It's making a choice. And so often I think that revolution begins just by listening. And in this case, I think it begins by listening to our own voices. And sometimes they're loud or quiet, those little voices inside ourselves, the ones that know that censorship and book bans are so deeply wrong, the ones that know that in nations that ban books and burn books, historically, they have also burned people. We understand that book banners are the enemies of liberty. And sometimes, even though we know that and we hear that voice, sometimes that inner voice can be drowned out by very real fears. Fears of being fired, attacked, doxxed, being called terrible, horrible names. And I understand that fear is real, and I'm not dismissing that. And I've experienced bans in multiple states. I have gotten called really horrible names. In New York City, at an event for internment, we actually had, at a bookstore, my publisher had to get me security guards for an author at a bookstore. And I've gotten canceled. Just recently, this last year, I was scheduled to speak at a school in New York City, a private school, a very prestigious one. And about an hour before I was supposed to speak, my agent got an email saying the visit has been canceled. We were not given a reason. I never had a visit. I mean, sometimes visits get canceled for weather or school things or whatever, but never have I been canceled an hour before I was supposed to speak. And they wouldn't really give us a reason. When pressed finally, and not by me or my agent, but when another author emailed them who had visited and said, "What is going on? This is terrible that this has happened to Samira, and I have a bad feeling I know why," they finally said that my presence represented a safety concern to the students, for the students. And I just want to add that my presence was going to be on Zoom. This was a virtual visit. I didn't know I had that kind of power to apparently create a safety concern via Zoom, but apparently I did. But we think this came from a parent complaint about my novels. So, look, I totally understand it, and I want to just acknowledge those fears, but I also want to say that we need to make sure that it does not overpower our voices. That's what book challengers, that's what these haters want. But I also want to talk about listening to other voices, the voices of our young people, especially the most marginalized ones. The ones who need more than ever to see themselves as a hero on the page, because I believe every child, regardless of demographics, deserves to see themselves as a hero on the page. Kids need to look into a book and sometimes be able to find themselves. Kids can use the story to navigate the difficulties in their own lives. And when we say some books don't belong on the shelves, when some stories are not okay, we aren't just taking titles off of our bookshelves. We're erasing identities. We're saying to those children, "Oh, you're queer, you're an author of color, your story doesn't count." And I get so enraged because I know how damaging that is to a child. And their voices are so often ignored and drowned out, especially when there's hateful, vitriolic adult voices shouting to ban these books in the names of protecting kids. That's what it is. That's what's happening in the United States. We have to protect our kids from these terrible books about, two boys kissing, or about racism, or about history. In Texas, just this week, a teacher was fired for teaching a graphic novel version of The Diary of Anne Frank. If Anne Frank as a 15-year-old can suffer through the most horrible thing, 15-year-olds, I think, can stand to read it. And they must, and we must teach it. We're not protecting our kids when we ban books. Let's just be straight about that. We're trying to erase them. So as ever, it's always the voices of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized that are being forcibly silenced by censorship. And we need to do everything we can in our power to ensure that their lives and their voices are not erased. So more specifically about book bans and censorship, everywhere I go, people ask, why? Why are books being banned, Samira? Why in the United States have literally thousands of books been banned and challenged over these last 3 years? Thousands in virtually every state. So I want to share some of the reasons that books are banned. Falsifying or rewriting history. Books are banned because they're morally corrupting to young people, because of grim or gruesome and violent depictions of war, which I have never read a book that showed. When you're writing about war, it's hard to imagine it being anything but grim. Books that are obscene, pornographic. I have been personally called obscene for some of my books because apparently they dare to express that there is Islamophobia and racism in the United States. Books are banned because they denigrate important historical figures, for attacking the nation's ideals, for being anti-patriotic, for depictions of sexual deviance, especially in references to transgender, queer, or intersex individuals, and banned because of content about race. Now, all of these should sound somewhat familiar to you if you're paying attention to some of the things that are happening in the US or increasingly here and elsewhere. But every one of these reasons that I've given were the exact reasons given for book bans in Nazi Germany in 1933. History repeats itself, right? Those bans led to a night of nationwide book burnings across 46 university towns when tens of thousands of books were burned. So it's terrifying, it should be terrifying, for us to compare anything now to what the Nazis were doing. But we cannot deny the parallels. And that's why we must fight them. And I think one of the biggest differences between now and book bans and book burnings that were happening with the Nazis were that the Nazis very insidiously activated students and collaborating teachers and librarians to instigate the book bans and the book burnings, but now we're the ones fighting them. And I think that gives me so much hope, and that is what makes me believe that we are going to win, because there are more of us. There are more of us who believe in these freedoms. There's more of us who want to protect our children. Helen Keller, who was one of the authors who was banned in Germany in 1933, and her books were burned, wrote this open letter to students who were participating in the book burnings. And she just simply said this: history has taught you nothing if you think you can kill ideas. That's what book banners today are trying to do. They're trying to kill the idea of more inclusive and equitable societies. They want to erase identities by saying they don't have a place on our shelves. They believe only some stories with some characters are suitable, that they're sufficiently tame and American enough or Irish enough, because as if like being American or being Irish can only be one single thing. But we're not going to let them ostracize human beings and destroy the freedom to read and to think and to live freely, because that's what censorship does. And that's where revolution comes in, right? That's how we are all revolutionaries. And I know we all know this, but just as a reminder, revolutionaries are not neutral. I know a lot of people, at least in the United States, think that classrooms and libraries need to be neutral spaces. Spaces that are apolitical. There's some people who even complain about art being political. I'm always accused of being political. Yes, I am. Art is political. But these spaces are not neutral. Our classrooms and libraries are not neutral. Book bans are political. Book bans are not neutral, and the spaces we create for kids must welcome every single child. And that is not a neutral idea. It's the morally and ethically correct one, but it is not neutral. And over time, we've seen that being inclusive, by opening our arms to everyone, by opening our borders. That concept is revolutionary to people. And it's the ones who want to hearken back to what was an exclusive and racist past by the status quo, who are the ones who are pushing back. I mean, that's why in the United States you have an entire party that wants to make America great again by excluding so many of us who are American. And honestly, look, I've been in this for like 3 years, and I know there's been a recent upsurge in challenges here too. And I'm not gonna lie, fighting book bans is totally exhausting. I have so many other things I could do, which is, like write books or feed my kids. But progress is always forward. And the people who fight progress, the ones who want to turn back the clock, they will not succeed, because you cannot kill an idea. You can't fight time, and you can't fight changing demographics. And we are all together going to make the choice to stand up for our kids. So This Book Won't Burn came out in May, and I want to talk a little bit about what inspired that novel. Now, novels take a very long time to get published. And this story about censorship, about a young woman, Noor, who is dealing with a family trauma and gets moved to a small town from Chicago. Her family moves from Chicago to a small town in Illinois, and she comes face to face with 500 books being pulled from the library shelves, virtually all by authors of color or queer authors. And so slowly, she kind of doesn't want to she kind of wants to keep her head down and just graduate. Sometimes in life you're like, I can't deal with this. But she knows she must, because there's that inner voice that she listens to that says she has to fight this. And so together, she and some of her fellow students form this group called Band Camp. And they start reading some of these banned books off campus. But as Noor pushes back, she faces some really very real dangers in her life. And I know that the book feels sort of timely, right? But it was written a while ago, and when I'm asked about the inspiration for this book and for all my other novels, I usually say that story ideas generally come to me in 3 ways: via a character, a conflict, or a question. And for This Book Won't Burn, it was really a question that inspired the whole novel, and it was from a story a teacher shared with me about 3 years ago. This was a teacher who taught English in Kansas, in a rural, pretty much all-white school. And she wanted to teach internment, that second novel that I mentioned about Muslims being put into internment camps. And she wanted to bring it to her lit circles. Now, lit circles are just sort of like mini book clubs in your classroom. So kids can choose books, they discuss them, they journal about them. And she wanted to bring internment in to talk about sort of parallels in history and to what was happening now. But 2 teachers at her school strongly objected to the novel being in the classroom. And when she pressed them a little bit, the reasons they gave her were there were no Muslims at the school and also no Indians. And my response, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. So my response is always, well, you probably have Lord of the Rings in your library and you don't teach hobbits. There's dragon books at your school, but probably no dragons in the classroom. So I find this bananas that this is some issue that comes up all the time. But this teacher told me that she was honestly kind of scared. She said she was nervous because no one had ever pushed back on her book choices. And she was scared that these 2 teachers were going to elevate their concerns and complaints to the superintendent or the school board, who had the power to fire her. And she said to me, Samira, I am the primary wage earner in my family. I'm a single mom. I've got 2 kids. And I basically didn't push back hard because I was scared of being fired. And what would I do then? But she was so disappointed in herself. So she asked me this question, Samira, what I want to know is, how can I be brave? I mean, honestly, this was like a gut punch when she asked me this question. I mean, first of all, I don't want anyone to get fired for teaching my books. Also, I don't think anyone should get fired for teaching my books, but like this teacher was simply trying to bring a book to her classroom because she said to me, I wanted the kids to see a world beyond the one in which they live. And honestly, I was so moved by her just trying. But I mean, it's just terrible that she had to face this, that she had to, number one, face this challenge by her own colleagues, but then also just feel terrible about herself because she didn't want to give in, but she didn't know what else to do. So that question, how can I be brave? How can I be brave has like haunted me. And remember how earlier I was talking about how we force our kids to be put in positions of courage? Well, that question, how can I be brave, is one that our kids ask so often. It's one that is at the heart of my novel. And, you know, Noor, the main character, and her friends have to ask themselves that question. And some of the, adult allies in her life have to ask that question as well. How can I stand up for something that I know is right, even if I'm scared to do so, even if there might be reprisals? How can I be brave? And again, we know it's not just fiction. Earlier when I said that, these young people are forced to find their courage, it's because of choices. Again, it goes back to that character building idea of everything about our character is a choice, right? And it's the choices that adults make and impose upon our kids that are so damaging and that are compelling these young people to ask this question, how can I be brave? I mean, in the United States, we have young people who, after one of our terribly ubiquitous school shootings, are marching on Washington and begging us, the adults, to stop school shootings, to stop them from being literally killed because they just are going to school. I mean, there was just a school shooting last week in the United States. Our kids shouldn't have to be begging us to keep them safe. They should expect it from us. God, I'm getting really hyped up, sorry. This novel and Bandcamp were really inspired by what I was seeing across the US, which is that in the face of book challenges, young people were out there marching against them. They were supporting their teachers. They were supporting their librarians. And I went to Michigan to speak at a school board meeting where two of my novels, Internment and Hollow Fires, had been pulled from the shelves. And while I was there, one young woman, a senior in high school, her last year in high school, came to speak in front of the school board. And as we say, she read them for filth. She essentially shamed them for saying that she did not have the freedom to choose what she wanted to read because a library, that's what a library is about. And some of the books, this was a school board that actually was for all grades, so kindergarten through 12th grade. I think they pulled 200 books. 70 of the books were picture books. And this young woman was simply telling them how wrong they were, how they were on the wrong side of history. And I just was thinking, as she's standing up there, and it was a full house. So she's standing in front of this panel of school board members. I think there were 7 of them. And there was maybe 100 people in the audience. And there she is standing up, essentially begging to be able to read whatever book she wants. How can I be brave? That young girl is an example of bravery. I think we could all learn a little lesson from that. Because when she spoke and when then I spoke to the school board, not a single one of them looked up from their table. They didn't look in our eyes at all. Book banners know they're wrong. In the United States, they're fighting so hard to call it something besides banning books because they know banning books is wrong. And that's why they wouldn't look at us in the eye when we spoke. And what This Book Won't Burn challenges us to do is to use our power and privilege for a purpose. That's what Noor does in the book. She comes from a marginalized background. She is by herself essentially at the school, but she knows she has some power and she has power of the word. And so she uses what power and privilege she does have to try to fight against these book bans. So I'm sure, like me, many of you are angry or perhaps even fearful about what can happen. And I just want to speak to that because before I came, I did a little bit of research because I was thinking, okay, they're having me come to Ireland to speak about book bans in America. Is that even a thing there? Apparently it is. I read a little bit about what happened in Cork last year, was it? And when your librarians were facing harassment and intimidations for shelving books by queer authors I saw a video of people ripping up Juno Dawson's book in the library. Who rips a book? And if I'm not wrong, I think it was not actually a library book. They actually bought the book and ripped it up in the library, which is also even nuts because I'm like, you just bought the book? I mean, book banners aren't logical people. So you look, I Googled a little bit, and I also learned that there's a history of book bans here, I guess related to the church. And I found that over time, I guess it was over 40 years, 12,000 books were banned. Books that were too sexy, too much kissing, queer books, etc. And I was actually astonished by that because I was like, okay, so fascism is in other places besides the US. But I loved how the Cork community actually came out to support their librarians. Because even though there were protesters against the library, there were more people who came out and rallied to support their librarians. And that's what we need to continue doing. We need to drown out the voices of the far right because they are so loud and so noisy. They're like that mosquito in your ear. And yes, we need to smash those voices. And we can drown those out because what they want is for the world to look like the narrow and prejudiced image they have of what it should be. And we simply cannot let that happen. So I know some of you, how many of you are teachers? Are there teachers in here? Yes, and librarians, children's authors. You're my people. I was also a high school teacher. And I worked in the library in college. And what that means is that you show up every day for our kids. You listen. Teachers and librarians and writers are revolutionaries. Why? Because for oppressors to succeed and for fascism to flourish and for alternative facts, it's like a favorite thing in the US, alternative facts, to become the truth, they all need one thing, and that is for ignorance to run rampant. And education and reading and writing and the existence of our libraries are antidotes to ignorance. I mean, can I just stop for a second and say how incredibly amazing a library is as a concept? You could just like walk into a building and check out a book that you want for free and get to read it. Like, I always say the libraries are the lighthouses of our democracy. Of all democracy, sorry. Again, US, so I'm just focusing on myself. But I just think libraries are so brilliant, and it's always, teachers and writers and poets and librarians who are at the forefront of fighting this. And I was actually in Dublin this June, and I was able to go to Kilmainham Jail, which, by the way, is like harder to get tickets to than like a Taylor Swift concert. For real. There's like this thing where at midnight they release tickets for a certain time. So I got tickets, and it was an amazing experience, and I got to learn more about the Easter Rising and that so many of the leaders were teachers and writers and poets. And I was thinking about how we always have, through time, faced so much hatred. And we have always spoken up about it. And it made me think of the wonderful Toni Morrison and something she said. And her words often stay with me. Some of them are just pinned above my desk. And she said to us, I want to remind us all that art is dangerous. I want to remind you of the history of artists who have been murdered, slaughtered, imprisoned, chopped up, refused entrance. The history of art whether it's in music or written, has always been bloody because dictators and people in office and people who want to control and deceive know exactly the people who will disturb their plans. And those people are artists. They're the ones who sing the truth. That is us. That is who we are. We are the ones who sing the truth. We are defenders of freedom. And just feel good about yourselves for being that, because it is so important. I mean, I know I'm like preaching to the choir, but sometimes you need to be like, hallelujah, choir, we are in this together. And I just want to say that, look, we can't just be against book bans in spirit. We need to fight them with action. So, again, even though I'm American, I don't actually think it's okay to barge into someone's country and tell them what to do. We are so good at that also. I'm sorry. But I do want to share some of the things that we are doing in the US, especially in my work with Authors Against Book Bans. So it just so happens that this next week is Banned Books Week in America. And what some of the things that we're doing and that maybe you can do in some way, we're sending authors to school board meetings. We're doing read-ins of banned books in front of local legislatures. We're signing petitions for local rights to read. We're writing postcards of support to our librarians. We are registering voters. Some of you might have heard there's an election coming up in America. We're creating scorecards for local politicians who are up for election and rating them on where they stand with book bans. We are partnering with organizations to give away banned books, especially in under-resourced communities, which is you give away banned books. We're holding book events where authors of banned books are joining with libraries and bookstores to read and to sell their books. And one thing that if you are a published author, you can actually join Authors Against Book Bans. Even though it is a US-based organization and most of our activities are in the US, I would love for there to be an Irish chapter of Authors Against Book Bans. And unfortunately, again, because of the US's dominance, I guess, in publishing, so much of what is happening in publishing spreads across the world. So if you want to join, authorsagainstbookbans.com is where you can join us. So I hate that this tide of book bans is sweeping America and that we have been exporting it because we've seen challenges here and we've seen libraries attacked and burned in England. I see challenges in Australia and Canada. I was even interviewed by Swedish national radio because even though they don't have book bans there, they want to prevent book bans from happening, which I love it. And they did begin the interview with a question about ABBA. I'm not even kidding. Look, so I think we can fight book bans because we must. We have to listen to those voices because there's more of us, defenders of freedom, than there are of them, the ones who hate freedom. So I just want to end by saying thank you. Thank you for loving our kids, for listening to them, and for affirming them. And thank you for being revolutionaries. Thanks so much. I think we have time for questions.
Samira, thank you. What a brilliant way to kick off the morning. We have time for questions. Aoife has the microphone. If you have a question in the room, please put your hand up. And if you would like to use the Slido, we have this QR code for the Q&A. And Samira, you weren't here yesterday, so you didn't get to hear Harry Woodgate, but they talked about hope being a discipline. So to hear from you that hope is a choice is just a reminder to us and a lovely way to kick off the day. Go ahead.
Hey, Samira, that was amazing. You actually made me cry halfway through that. I just wanted to ask you, you've obviously seen pushback from, politicians and various people. Have you experienced any pushback in the publishing industry?
That is a great question to everyone here. Have I experienced pushback in the publishing industry? So in the United States, publishing is like everything else. It's pretty racist. But I am very lucky that I have an amazing editor in the U.S., Alvina Ling, and Little Brown Books for Young Readers has welcomed my work. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't pushback because here's the thing. publishers in the U.S., especially Penguin Random House and a bunch of other publishers have gotten together and are actually engaging in lawsuits against certain states. And I think that's great. But at the same time, they also publish books by book banners. Like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. God, he's the worst. Mm-hmm. They publish his autobiography. They make money off him. You know, they publish stuff by all of them. So it's like really, it's kind of hard to take when you know that yes, they're publishing my book about book bans. They are actually working with authors against book bans because it does affect their bottom line. Because I know sometimes in the US I get this question, well, isn't it an honor to have your book banned? Doesn't that mean more kids are going to read it? No. I mean, I'm not Stephen King. Like, when his books get banned, he was like, oh, everyone go to a bookstore and buy my books. Very few authors see an increase in that. So there are, especially amongst queer authors and authors of color, there's really a real fear in the US about that. And also, I mean, authors and illustrators do not become really rich from publishing books. Again, if you're Stephen King or one of these dudes, yes, maybe. But a lot of us who work with children's books are asked to speak at libraries and schools, and for so many authors, that has been completely cut off. So, you know, my friend Phil Bildner, for example, he is a queer author. He normally has anywhere between 15 to 20 school visits a year. This year, he has had one request. So there's sort of pushback in a lot of ways.
I've got a question here, and then we'll come to Niamh in the audience. So one comment to say, I feel so brave now. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yay.
Which is really lovely. And one question to say, what happened to the teacher whose question inspired This Book Won't Burn?
So I haven't kept in touch with her because even though she spoke to me anonymously. She didn't tell me her district name. And to what I know is, because she told me the story after it happened, she still had her job because I don't think she brought that book into her classroom because she couldn't. But I don't hold that against her because what she was trying to do, especially in a school district like that, was pretty amazing. But I mean, yes, there are teachers who have been fired. There was a teacher who was fired, and this was actually in the book because in This Book Won't Burn, I tried to use real life examples of things that were happening. And one teacher, now I'm going to forget what state she taught in, was fired because she provided the QR code for the Brooklyn Public Library. Because when book bans were sweeping the country, as they still are, Brooklyn said, okay, to any kid out there, we will let you check out any book. You don't need to be from Brooklyn. You don't need to have a Brooklyn Library card. Go to our QR code and we'll let you check out any book, ebook. And so she posted that code and was fired. I mean, fired for posting the code for a public library.
No, they're amazing. Brooklyn Library are worth a follow on Instagram. Yes. They're really pushing back. Go ahead.
Thanks, Samira. I live in Cork, and I do my writing in many, many libraries, and I noticed a sudden increase in staff in libraries. And I asked the staff, why is there more staff now? And it was after the Juno Dawson book burning, and I just loved that the library's reaction to that was, okay, we're going to give more staff to our libraries to support our workers. And that actually made me really emotional, and it made me think the support coming from the top down is so important for the actual librarians. And libraries in Ireland anyway, they're public, they're publicly funded. And my question is, in America, does it matter if it's publicly funded or private? Like, are publicly funded libraries having the same extent of book banning as private libraries? And I just think if it's top down support, it makes you much braver.
Yeah, agree. You can be braver when you know there's someone who has your back. So in the U.S., most of our libraries are public, so they are funded by taxpayers. But unfortunately, most libraries have library boards. Those are elected positions, like locally elected officials who manage the budget and that kind of thing. And unfortunately, what's happened is many of these library boards have been infiltrated by the right and are leading some of the book bans. So some of the book bans are coming from the people who are essentially in charge of the libraries, which is so painful. I love that they hired more librarians as an answer to this. And unfortunately, in the States, many libraries, many of the library boards are doing the opposite. They're actually going after their own librarians and firing them. And there are obviously some other libraries where they are supporting their librarians, but unfortunately it's not across the board. I wish it were. I wish every library had more staff. Honestly, every library does need more staff. Because libraries are just so much more than just borrowing books. In the States, it's like free access to computers, to the internet, to people who don't have it. They bring in speakers, they have workshops, they provide a safe space to go after school. And I just think libraries are brilliant. So I wish every library was better funded.
Hear, hear. We have a comment to say we have to run our LGBT youth writing group on days when the library is closed so that the young folk don't get harassed. Thank you for the hope.
That's terrible.
And you spoke on it a bit already, but can you tell us more about discussions with young readers about book bans and what their attitudes are towards it?
I find young people so inspiring because they know that book bans are wrong. Again, like I said, I was an 80s kid, and back in the day, they wanted to put like these labels on music. It was Al Gore's wife who was leading this charge for music that was like, I don't know, was gonna make us all drug addicts or something. I don't know. But I have found that young people are when I go to schools, I generally I'm speaking to kids who also read books all the time, but they are really, really against book bans because, I don't know about when you were a teenager, but I personally didn't love when adults were telling me what to do. And I think especially because now, especially with Gen Z, this generation is so amazing to me. They're so aware and, that's why there's groups forming. There's like banned book clubs at schools and that kind of thing. And there are some kids who are very influenced by their parents who are supporting book bans. And, these parents are supporting it under this guise like, I don't want my child to read this. And young people know like, okay, unfortunately for your kid, you get to control what's in your house and they can't read that book, but you don't have a right to tell me what I can read. I'm not your kid. No other parent has a right to tell some other parent what their child can read. And so the kids are very, very aware of that. And also, Gen Z in America, for the most part, is much more, they have the awareness of queer identity and what it means to be a child of color. And so they're much more open to things.
That's great to hear. Someone has said that to add to the increase of staff, the library that they work in got a security guard to help staff against aggressive behaviour and potential far-right harassment. And I know that was a response that happened across several libraries and
There's more security guards in
Yes.
Irish libraries now. Oh God, that is terrible. And it's all mostly because queer books are on the shelves.
Yeah.
Anti-immigrant sentiment.
Yeah, they're a small, noisy bunch. And it is all about queer books. And again, the language that you used about protecting childhood and you know being Irish and all of that is what we're hearing. But
so loud. It's like they need another hobby.
they really do. They're not even very good at the one they have.
I don't
thankfully.
like bread making, like we were all doing the pandemic or something. For God, God.
Yeah, I think there's one in the audience. It's Leona. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, Samira. I'm an author and I'm also a teacher and I teach teenagers. So to offer you hope, the easiest thing you can do with teenagers is tell them they don't want you reading this book because, and it's a guarantee that they will go and find that book and read it. So one of the things they've taken off the junior search at the moment is Romeo and Juliet, because they feel that it could be a trigger to some kids and that there is, things in it that they wouldn't be able to handle. So I often say to the kids, this is what the story is about, but they feel that you're too immature to deal with this. And they think that you won't be able to handle this. And the kids have such a sense of, how dare they? I am able for this. And they will go and seek it out and say, I read that. There was nothing in it. So telling them why, this is the thing they fear is one of the best ways to get kids to read those banned books.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, like I said, teens don't love being told what to do, but at the same time, if the book isn't on the library shelf, it's really hard to access it. But yeah, Romeo and Juliet. Wow, that
Phenomenal.
that Shakespeare corrupting our youth.
I cannot tell you how hard we work to ask some teachers to change up what they're teaching in the classroom. So the fact that that's been taken off is very interesting. We are about to finish up. I have one 30-second question for you. We want to know, what was the ABBA question? What does Sweden
Okay,
want
so
to know?
this is so Authors Against Book Bans, AABB, is very close to ABBA. And they basically asked me, like, would there be a theme song from? I mean, and I was like,
What?
Waterloo? Dancing Queen. I was like, please come back to me on that one. But I really love that you started with that. I was like, when you were talking about national identity, I was like, dang, ABBA is like in their blood.
Jeez. It's like 3 years in. It's like, Mamma Mia, here we go again.
That would have been the answer.